Crisis Radio, broadcasting this week from Reykjavik, Iceland, ground zero in the great financial battle of the North Atlantic. Iceland, David against the Goliath, Great Britain, and the Dutch, the Anglo-Dutch monopolistic combine, sinister, oligarchical, elitist is the enemy. Great deal of political ferment here. We had 3 months of mass strike developments. We had assemblies at the Parliament and the banks basically every week, hundreds and thousands of people taking part, high degree of political awareness, right? It is a good example of how the Depression wakes people up politically. Anyway, the crisis of the Icelandic crown in 06 and 07 then turned into the world banking crisis of 07 to 08, Northern Rock, Royal Bank of Scotland, Lloyds Bank, all of these blowing up, and Iceland then getting sucked into the maelstrom of the British crisis because of the harebrained scheming of Gordon Brown. Now, at the height of the crisis, there was a panic run on these Icelandic banks, possibly because the British banks were all in the process of failing. So the 3 banks, Kaupthing, Glitnir, Landsbanki in particular, with the IceSave branches in the British and Dutch cities. At the height of the crisis, Gordon Brown seized IceSave, prevented them from paying. They might have been able to pay more. And he then said, I am going to say that we're going to pay £100,000 for everybody who had one of these accounts, even though the general level in the European Union is about £20,000, I believe. Gordon Brown just decided that he would be generous with those British savers at the expense of Iceland. And then he turned around and said to Iceland, guess what? You owe me £20 billion. Now, they got him down from that. The situation then was that Gordon Brown was demanding this money, and he got the European Union and then the IMF, because the Icelanders then said, oh, my God, we're in a financial crisis. We've got to stabilize. We need an IMF loan to rebuild our reserves and stabilize their currency. They've committed the potentially fatal mistake of inviting the International Monetary Fund in. We know that once you get the IMF in, you never get them out. They have no success stories. They deal in that discredited free market Washington consensus: deregulation, privatization, union busting, no state sector, no health services, no education, more or less what's done to the United States by Obama in slightly different form. The question, therefore, right now is, can Iceland ever pay? There's an offer on the table by the Icelandic government, which I regard as also a mistake. The Icelandic government said, well, this is now a social democratic government. We might be able to pay you 6% of the future growth of our gross domestic product. We're willing to set that aside for debt payments between 2014, I believe, and 2024 or thereabouts. This is a mistake, as we discussed last week. Peru, under Alan Garcia, 1985, made an offer which was actually more clever than what the Icelanders are talking about. That was 10% of the foreign exchange earnings, 10% of the actual dollars that you got from exports might be available for the international bankers and the IMF. That sounds plausible, but it turned out to be a fatal mistake, a terrible, tragic mistake by Alan Garcia. He needed to declare a debt moratorium. Instead, he tried to pay. The bankers treated him as a communist and a terrorist. He got all the disadvantages of a debt moratorium without any of the tremendous advantages that he could have had. Peru slipped into hyperinflation. Peru then slipped into dictatorship under Fujimori. This is a bad result. So the big hope here in Iceland is that the British and the Dutch will reject the 6% of future GDP offer, and therefore they will essentially get the Icelanders out of this bind that they're now in. Because if the British and the Dutch reject a reasonable offer, then a lot of people in Iceland are going to say, we've had it, we're fed up. There are important forces in the parliament that want to get the IMF out of the Icelandic picture, and there are others who are now I think, quite interested in the concept of a debt moratorium. Remember, under globalization, over the past couple of decades, we've had 30 to 40 countries that have declared debt moratorium. Let's just remind ourselves of this list. We'll go through it. Countries that have declared debt moratorium between 1980 and 2004. Albania, quite small, quite poor. Algeria, Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Bulgaria, Chile, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Jordan, Mexico, Moldova, Morocco, Nigeria, Pakistan, Panama, Peru, the Philippines, Poland, Romania, Russian Federation, South Africa, Turkey, Ukraine, Uruguay, Venezuela. That's quite a list. That's a cross-section of the world. Countries big, small, left-wing, right-wing, Latin American, Eastern European, South Asian, Catholic, Muslim, nothing at all, big, little, with oil, without oil, with minerals, without minerals. It's a general tendency of all nations under this bankrupt, globalized hot money system that sooner or later a debt moratorium is essential. The big examples, of course, are Mexico in 1982 with Lopez Portillo. With that Mexican debt moratorium 1982, we could have gone towards a debtors cartel, an organization of the debtor countries to counter the extortion and blackmail of the well-organized creditors with some kind of organized resistance. The creditors are organized in the IMF, the World Bank, the Bank for International Settlements, the London Club, the Paris Club. Why shouldn't the debtors, why shouldn't the poor countries, the countries that are on the receiving end of all this, have their own united front? Maybe if Iceland goes for a debt moratorium, then they'll be joined by other countries as well. Iceland could precipitate a whole series of other countries around the world, poorer countries. For example, the countries that are active in UNCTAD. We have a call recently from the Secretary General of UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, calling for a debt moratorium for the poorest and most indebted countries. Well, Iceland has recently been considered the most developed country in the world from certain standpoints, but thanks to Gordon Brown and Balkenende, they now risk going into the category of the most indebted and indeed poor countries. So there's no shame in a debt moratorium. There's no opprobrium. My God, everybody does it. Nuclear powers like Russia, proud, ancient countries, Mexico, countries that have come out of nowhere in recent years like Moldova. And in particular, Iceland is a small island, but 300,000 people. Is Iceland so different from Costa Rica or from Panama? Costa Rica, very small, no military forces. Similarly here, Iceland, no real standing army. There is a navy. There's also a tradition of fighting. The Cod Wars, when the British in the 1970s tried to monopolize the fisheries here in the North Atlantic. People may remember these British cruisers, fairly heavy warships, colliding with small Icelandic patrol vessels, very unequal, but the Icelanders were able to stand off the British and prevent them from dictating the new division of the North Atlantic fisheries. So it's been about one debt moratorium per year over the last couple of decades. Iceland could be the beginning of a new wave, a debt moratorium leading to the assertion of national sovereignty and national independence. We'll be right back with Þórarinn Einarsson, who's going to give us a report from the Icelandic point of view.